A new environment and a change of tone. That seemed to be the atmosphere of Hassan Rouhani's visit as Iran's president to New York last week. Rouhani traveled from Tehran to take part in the 68th Annual United Nations General Assembly and to kickstart negotiations to resolve Iran's long-standing nuclear standoff with the West, notably the United States. And as expected, the hottest ticket at the United Nations General Assembly was for Rouhani himself, who made his debut speech as the newly elected Iranian president. He started with a message of yes to peace and no to war, and put forth his wave proposal, as in World Against Violence and Extremism. He called on constructive engagement with other countries based on mutual respect.
Iran seeks constructive engagement with other countries based on mutual respect and common interests, and within the same framework does not seek to increase tensions with the United States.
The speech came only a few hours after the Iranian president's U.S. counterpart Barack Obama delivered his own speech before the General Assembly. He also called for mutual respect when referring to the decades of animosity between the two countries.
I don't believe this difficult history can be overcome overnight. The suspicions run too deep. But I do believe that if we can resolve the issue of Iran's nuclear program, that can serve as a major step down a long road towards a different relationship, one based on mutual interests and mutual respect.
While many had anticipated there would be a face-to-face meeting between the two leaders, rumors were put to rest by U.S. officials saying the two sides had no plans to meet. The Iranian president's last day in New York ended with a press conference. When asked by reporters about why he didn't meet with his U.S. counterpart during his stay, Rouhani said that there simply wasn't enough time. What we didn't know at the press conference was that U.S. President Barack Obama would soon talk on the phone with his Iranian counterpart, making diplomatic history. The 15-minute conversation consisted of both leaders agreeing on accelerating talks aimed at diffusing the dispute over Iran's nuclear program and plans for peaceful relations. Also attending the United Nations General Assembly was Iran's Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif, who had arrived in New York prior to the president and stayed almost a week later. A former diplomat with good personal relations with many high-ranking officials in the U.S. and Europe, Dr. Zarif navigated his way from one meeting to another, often being stopped in the hallways by other officials for a small chat or a quick hello. Zarif's schedule was busy to say the least, often holding more than a dozen meetings a day. The new foreign minister is now also in charge of Iran's nuclear file. After a few meetings with EU Foreign Policy Chief Catherine Ashton, the Iranian foreign minister sat side by side with his U.S. counterpart, Secretary of State John Kerry, at a meeting with the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council plus Germany, often referred to as the P5+1, the highest-ranking meeting between U.S. and Iranian officials in more than 3 decades.
Letting Mr. Zarif sit down with the P5+1 in New York, that was a major breakthrough, and that had never happened before. The Iranian foreign minister sitting down with the people who negotiate the nuclear thing. So in the past, American diplomats tended to run when they saw an Iranian diplomat. So now the fact that they would not only sit down, but then the Secretary of State apparently said, do you mind if we have a few words in private? And they spent 30 minutes in really serious conversation. Then, of course, in addition to all the speeches and everything else, the telephone call, because the picture of the President of the United States sitting in the Oval Office, picking up the phone to talk to the President of Iran, and signing off with Khoda Hafez, that was amazing.
Gary Sick is a senior research scholar at Columbia University's Middle East Institute and an adjunct professor at the School of International and Public Affairs. Sick served on the National Security Council under U.S. Presidents Ford, Carter, and Reagan. He was the principal White House aide for Iran during the Iranian Revolution. Sikh is also a retired captain in the U.S. Navy, with service in the Persian Gulf, North Africa, and the Mediterranean. Sikh believes the latest developments were a positive first step in better U.S.-Iran relations.
By Rouhani coming here and making the kind of speeches that he made, seeing the people that he saw, appointing Mr. Zarif as his foreign minister and letting him meet with literally everybody who is anybody in New York and Washington. Having done that, they are, in effect, Iran was signaling, we are ready.
He adds, however, the real test will be when the Iranian side sits down at the negotiating table with the U.S. and the Europeans in Geneva on October 15th.
I do think, however, that if this meeting goes well in first Geneva and then perhaps Vienna with the IAEA, we will have something then to actually say there's something concrete to show for this. And that's where we are right now.
While there is a sense of cautious optimism, many still remember the last time the U.S. and Iran came close to reaching a deal and how it fell through. In 2003, Iran offered an appealing agreement sent by Zarif himself that basically drafted the outlining that Iran would halt enrichment activity as a means for confidence building and was ready to strike a deal with the United States. It was Hassan Rouhani who had brought on the negotiations, and Iran voluntarily halted all enrichment activities for 2 years. However, the U.S. never answered its mail and by default rejected their agreement. And so the question many are asking now is, how is this time different?
Two things have happened. Time has gone by. The cost of any kind of an agreement has gone up very substantially on both sides. But the other thing that has changed is that there's a very different president in the United States. In fact, there was a memo circulated by the Iranians to the Americans in 2003, and then a proposal that was made in 2005. And in both cases, the first one, the United States never even read the memo or never answered it. And the second case, the American side showed not only no interest, but they actually refused to accept the deal that had been worked out with the Europeans. We weren't talking directly to Iran at that time.
What Iranians back home want to see come out of talks with the West is the lifting of sanctions imposed on the country, most of them unilaterally by the United States. In June 2013, the Obama administration passed its 9th round of sanctions against Iran. White House Press Secretary Jay Carney said at the time, this new action targets Iran's currency, the rial, by authorizing the imposition of sanctions on foreign financial institutions that knowingly conduct or facilitate significant transactions for the purchase or sale of the Iranian rial, or that maintain significant accounts outside Iran dominated in the Iranian rial. They also include a ban on the sale or transfer of goods or services intended for Iran's auto sector, the second largest employer in the country. The measure had been approved by the U.S. House Committee on Foreign Affairs on May 22, 2013, and on May 31st, the U.S. Treasury Department issued a statement announcing sanctions on 8 Iranian petrochemical companies. They followed a 2012 set of sanctions by the U.S. and the European Union on Iran's oil and financial sectors, with the goal of preventing other countries from purchasing Iranian oil and conducting transactions with the Central Bank of Iran. These measures have caused inflation in Iran to skyrocket. Prices for fuel, rent, food, and other basic necessities have risen by 100% in some instances. One particularly devastating effect of these financial sanctions is the inability of pharmaceutical companies to purchase and import basic life-saving medicine, ranging from Tylenol to cancer medicine and even prenatal vitamins. Iran says the sanctions are illegal and that the measures have been taken against the country based on assumptions that Iran's nuclear program is for non-civilian objectives. Iran argues that it has the right to use nuclear technology for peaceful purposes as a committed signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty known as the NPT and a member of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA. Addressing the UN General Assembly, President Rouhani of Iran called sanctions inhumane and unjust.
Contrary to the claims of those who pursue and impose them, it is not the state and the political elite that are targeted, but rather it is the common people who are victimized by these sanctions.
During his press conference in New York, when asked about Iran's troubled economy back home, a blunt and open Rouhani said that he didn't know the numbers were that bad, and that has promised the Iranian nation to release a report after his first 100 days in office.
What I see today is a little worse than what I said or thought existed before. But we are all hopeful about the future. Our social and economic problems can be resolved.
When I asked the Iranian foreign minister if there was talk on the possibility of easing sanctions during his meeting with Secretary of State John Kerry and other members of the P5+1, this is what he answered.
We believe that sanctions are counterproductive in addition to being not founded in international law. Of course, as we move forward, there has to be removal of sanctions, and in the end game, there has to be a total lifting of all sanctions, and both bilateral sanctions, unilateral sanctions, as well as multilateral sanctions and UN sanctions, and we hope to be able to move in that direction within a short span of time.
While U.S. President Barack Obama has executive power to remove some of the sanctions, he will likely face opposition from Washington hardliners.
The president does have the capacity to basically, the executive orders that exist, he can sign his name and do away with some, not nearly all of them. So he might do that, but he's got to be very careful because there are people in Washington, especially in the Congress, that are looking over his shoulder and saying, don't give away anything until you get something really concrete in return.
Sanctions have also banned Iran from the global banking network, known by its acronym SWIFT, which allowed money to be transmitted electronically. Now businesses conduct their money flow physically. So for the average Iranian businessman, this means they are unable to arrange simple financing for business deals by, say, opening a letter of credit or LC. SIC calls this the weapon of mass destruction of all sanctions.
It's the banking system. That is, I say that is America's weapon of mass destruction against Iran. And it is having an enormous impact. And I think they might be able to lift some aspects of it sort of incrementally, but basically I think we're going to have to get a little further down the line before the president will feel that he has enough in his hand to go ahead. And of course, as you know very well, President Obama is fighting a lot of other battles at the same time. I mean, this whole business of a government shutdown, and the sequester that is going on, where everybody's budget is being cut, and then we've got a debt relief ceiling that is coming up just very shortly, within weeks after this. So he's going to be in outright warfare with the Congress during a good part of this time. And so how much will he be willing to give Iran, which is not popular on Capitol Hill? How much will he be willing to give up, knowing that he is in fact in this kind of a battle?
But Washington had also maintained an embargo on new plane and spare parts purchased by Iran since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, long before there was talk of a nuclear standoff. SIC tells me, although not publicized, there is a strong lobby in Washington which has already started working on lifting those set of sanctions.
They won't publicize it, but one of the first people through the door after the Rouhani speech and the sort of breaking of the ice was the Boeing company, who wants to sell aircraft engines to Iran. And they have some very good people in Washington who are making that case, and that has been revisited in the past, and it is one of the things that can be done.
In his UN address, President Obama seemed serious about working things out harmoniously with Iran, as he stated that he will spend a good remainder of his term to pursue better relations with the country and finally resolve the controversies surrounding its nuclear program. However, the president had a change of tone when he met a few days later with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, often flip-flopping on his previous statements and repeating past rhetoric about keeping all options, including a military strike against Iran, on the table. When the Israeli leader addressed the UN General Assembly, he threatened unilateral military action from Israel if Iran does not halt its enrichment activities.
When Mr. Netanyahu showed up and they had a meeting, the language, the rhetoric in that meeting began to shift back toward where it had been before. He referred to the Iranian regime. He began talking again about no option is off the table and all of this kind of thing, all of which grates very much on Iranian nerves. And I think they were really disappointed that he went back to use those old words.
With even Republicans like John McCain of Arizona and Lindsey Graham of South Carolina backing Obama's cautious engagement efforts, many believe Israel is losing an enemy. Ironically, something it may not be able to afford.
There's an old story from the Cold War. People disagree about this, and it may not even be true, but supposedly the foreign minister or the ambassador of the Soviet Union at that time, this was at the time just before the fall of the wall, and the the foreign minister of the Soviet Union is reputed to have said to either Henry Kissinger or to his successor that we are going to do to you the worst thing that one country can do to another. In the days of the Cold War, that was a scary thing to say. He said, "What's that?" And he said, "We're going to deprive you of an enemy." And so the Soviet Union was saying, okay, your days of basically basing all of your strategy, all of your actions, everything that you do on us, the Soviet Union, as the enemy of all enemies, is going to end. We have the situation where, from the Israeli point of view, they face the prospect of perhaps losing their best enemy. That the enemy of Iran, which has been useful for fundraising, for identifying what their greater interests were, for mobilizing world opinion around their position, and all of these things. And also, to be fair, shoving aside the Palestinian issue, that whole business of having Iran to focus on is, in fact, at risk. Hasn't happened yet, but it's at risk of actually disappearing. And it seems to me that's what Mr. Netanyahu was really talking about in his speech at the UN, which basically was, don't believe it, don't believe it, don't believe it. Iran is still the enemy.
Dov Waxman is a professor at Baruch College. He specializes in international relations, Middle East politics, Israeli politics, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and U.S. foreign policy toward the Middle East. I met Waxman to talk more about the future of U.S.-Israeli relations in light of the latest developments with Iran. Waxman says despite appearances, the U.S. and Israel, and especially Barack Obama and Benjamin Netanyahu, aren't necessarily on the same page when it comes to dealing with Iran.
So I think there's always been this underlying tension and gap in the US and Israeli positions, even though in public they have stressed that they've always been on the same page, that they've been unified, and they've gone to great lengths to kind of show this public face of unity. But I think underlying that there is a slight difference of opinion, a difference of opinion in terms of particularly the costs and benefits of military action. That said, when it comes to the specifics of an agreement, I think the real difference here, which will possibly emerge over time, will be the willingness to allow some kind of enrichment capability. It seems that the United States and the other Western powers will be willing to allow Iran to retain their nuclear rights, which is what the Rouhani and, in fact, the entire Iranian establishment insist upon, and the Iranian public for that matter. They will accept some limited enrichment capability.
While the United Nations was underway in New York, Waxman was attending the J Street Conference in Washington, D.C., often referred to as a pro-Israeli group, which was formed as an alternative to the more hawkish group AIPAC. The group was formed about 5 years ago and has often made efforts to convince lawmakers on Capitol Hill that supporting Israel does not mean agreeing with everything advocated by Israel's conservative Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The meeting focused on finding a peaceful solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, another issue U.S. President Barack Obama has vowed to focus on for the remainder of his presidency.
What was less addressed at the UN, but what was being addressed in Washington, was the other major issue that the Obama administration has at least said it's going to be focused on, which is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and trying to resolve that. And of course, that's another time that's ticking away, both in terms of the viability of a two-state solution. Many people, including myself, really believe that this is really the last chance to reach a viable two-state solution. And the administration itself has set this somewhat ambitious 9-month time frame for the negotiations to succeed. So in that context, a primarily a Jewish American organization called J Street, which was set up just 5 years ago as a kind of alternative to AIPAC, which has been the lobby in Washington that has been taking a major role in kind of strengthening US-Israeli relations, and generally is seen as more hardline or less compromising, not only on the Iranian issue, but also on the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. And so one of the significant things about this conference was that Vice President Joe Biden was one of the keynote speakers at the conference, as was Nancy Pelosi, US House leader. So this is really signaling to members of Congress and to the American Jewish community that J Street is a legitimate political player in Washington. I mean, if Biden goes to speak with them, this says something. And that means that they have a increasing voice within Washington. So what congressmen and senators are going to be hearing from, and what they were hearing from yesterday, as many of the attendees, the delegates to this conference, then fanned out across Capitol Hill, those offices that were still open on Capitol Hill, to basically make the case that, in fact, American Jews want a two-state solution urgently, and they want the United States to be very active in bringing that about. And that's not the message that lawmakers in Congress have traditionally heard from the American Jewish community. They've often heard about the need for raising sanctions on Iran.
However, Waxman tells me that U.S. Vice President Joe Biden's speech was somewhat a disappointment for those who attended the conference. It was a speech he might as well have given at AIPAC or anywhere else for the matter. Biden's
speech was basically the speech that he might have given to the AIPAC conference. So in terms of the people who are actually sitting in that room listening to the speech, there was something of a disappointment. I mean, he gave a kind of tour of the Middle East, and at the end he talked about why this was an opportune time to make peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. But he was very short on specifics. He didn't raise anything. He didn't mention the issue of Israeli settlement expansion, which many people believe is one of the things that's undermining the prospects for a two-state solution. He avoided mention of that. And so it was kind of a general speech, the kind of speech that he would have given to any organization. But the very fact that he was there is significant, and it does suggest that the administration recognizes now that there are a variety of views within the American Jewish community.
I wrapped up the conversation with both my guests asking about the current turmoil in Syria. They both agree, like it or not, the pivotal role Iran will ultimately have to play at the negotiating table.
You do need to involve Iran. I mean, look, we've seen this in Iraq. If you don't have, by marginalizing Iran in Iraq, Iraq is still very unstable, and in fact it's getting worse. So I think any long-term stability in Syria, whether you like it or not, requires talking to the Iranians and bringing them on board as well.
Iran actually, in a peculiar way, because of its experience with Saddam Hussein and chemical weapons, is one of the most active countries that want to see chemical weapons ended. And that includes Assad's chemical weapons. And now that he has in fact embraced the Chemical Weapons Convention, I think that's something that the United States understands, that Iran can in fact be very useful in making sure that he keeps his promises. At the same time, Iran's concept of what they want in Syria from a political point of view is not necessarily with Assad staying there forever, but to have a political settlement that in fact will protect all the different parties to the conflict and won't end up in a civil war where everything collapses suddenly and you have really a crazy radical Islamists coming in and taking over the government, which in many ways would be even worse than what we've got now. So that is basically, as I understand it, that's the US position too. So basically, we are sort of on the same page.
Both Iran and the United States agree that in order to have a lasting solution to the impasse regarding Iran's nuclear program and the deadlock in relations for the past 3 decades or so, there has to be mutual respect and understanding. The next few weeks will determine how effective the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly really were. That's all the time we have for this edition of Inside Out. Thanks so much for staying with us and watching. Remember, you can always send me your emails to insideout@susanmadaris.com. I'm always looking forward to them. You can also follow me on Twitter for latest updates and discussions. Until next week in another show, goodbye.